Welcome to Spotlight on Schools. We focus on the Rochester City Schools. I'm your host, Jim Strauss. For years now, we've read that Rochester has been in the bottom 5 in the country for concentrated poverty and segregation. This is reflected in its schools. With a graduation rate of less than 50% and test scores well behind those of its suburban neighbors, the Rochester City School District has been working to find solutions. One Rochester-based group that has been working to address these issues is Great Schools for All. Its mission, simply put, is to advance short-term and long-term solutions to the issue of concentrated poverty. With me today are 2 members of Great Schools for All, Don Pryor and Mark Hare. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Great Schools for All has reached out to the Rochester City School Board, among others, with encouraging results. Also joining me today, for the 3rd time on Spotlight on Schools, is Rochester City School Board member Willa Powell. Welcome back.
Pleasure to be here.
I'm glad you're back from vacation and you're pretty much all in one piece. Okay, Great Schools for All has developed a proposal called Breakthrough Schools. Don, you're going to handle this. What is a breakthrough school?
Well, we have conceived of breakthrough schools as kind of a network of primarily magnet schools, basically cross-district, socioeconomically diverse schools. We have thought of this in the context of schools that basically would offer programs or types of offerings that even the most well-off suburban school district may not be able to afford by itself, where there wouldn't be sufficient critical mass within a given individual district to do it. So we have thought of these based on a lot of research and a lot of things going on in other communities throughout the country as a network of essentially magnet schools that would draw people from both the city and from suburban school districts, and that this would be done on a voluntary basis. We aren't talking about creating a countywide school district or anything that politically isn't likely to fly, but we're really saying on a voluntary basis, how can we bring together operators from the city school district, from suburban districts, to create magnet schools, unique kinds of opportunities that otherwise wouldn't exist, and that are based on socioeconomic diversity, and that bring people together in learning opportunities that wouldn't otherwise exist.
Okay. This proposal raises certain buzzwords to somebody who doesn't know the whole proposal. Words like integration, words like busing. Up to now, the Rochester City School District has worked largely to improve within its boundaries, with a few exceptions. This proposal seems like an uphill battle. How do you react to that?
I don't think it's as much of an uphill battle as it might have been 30 or 40 years ago. I think people's perceptions and attitudes have changed fairly dramatically in that period of time. And I think some of the things you mentioned, Jim, like, for example, busing, it's an issue that comes up in conversation, but the reality is that it's been more than 40 years since the Supreme Court and the Milliken v. Bradley case in Detroit struck down mandatory busing as a way to integrate schools across school district lines. So it's not happening. It hasn't happened in 40 years. It's not going to happen here. It's not going to happen anywhere. So we can kind of take those things that people are most fearful of right off the table to begin with. But it seems like this is a time when we can at least begin to have these conversations now, and people seem to be open to it.
One of the things that's allowed that to happen is the proliferation of charter schools. People are choosing other schools besides their home district and their home school, and they're getting on buses to do it. So the stigma of busing has essentially evaporated among parents in terms of where they choose to send their kids. It continues to be an issue with communities outside of the parent community, folks that don't like seeing all those school buses on their street in the morning. That's where the resistance is really coming from.
Okay.
We'll talk about this a little bit more later on, but related to this subject is a survey that we did about a year ago, which really suggests that a lot of the barriers that you're referring to are, as Mark suggests, kind of not necessarily ancient history, but not the significant barriers that we might have thought they would be. That parents are very open to the idea of multi-district, diverse school settings if you offer an opportunity for their child that might not otherwise exist. So we can talk more about that later, but I think I think the barriers are certainly less than by what parents are telling us themselves than might have been the case before.
Well, as long as we're talking about it, let's go to that. Would you tell us, first of all, how that survey was designed and what were the results? Can you be a little more specific about that?
Well, we wanted to get a clear sense of what parents of existing school-age kids thought about diversity and about cross-district opportunities, about various kinds of magnet programs, and we wanted this to be done in a scientific way with a population that was representative of the larger population. So we hired a group called Metrics Matrix, which has done a lot of surveys in this community and other communities, so that we would be so it would be done professionally. They did a survey of 600 parents, equally split between city and suburbs, and it's very much that within the margin of error, met all the scientific requirements. The population was diverse in terms of socioeconomic status, grade level, city, suburb, white, black, Hispanic, all of those. It was very representative of the overall parent population.
We've got about a minute and a half left in this segment, so in that time, tell us, what were the results?
Basically, we were, frankly, very positively surprised at at the results. We basically found that in both city and suburbs, more than 80% of the parents said that they were open to sending their child to a program that was more socioeconomically diverse than their current setting. They were very much open to a variety of different types of options, which perhaps we can talk about in the next segment. And to me, the most important thing was that almost 3/4 of them, both city and suburbs, said that they were willing to have their child bused across district lines to go outside of their existing district to a school in another part of the county if it was safe, if it was socioeconomically diverse, and if it opened an opportunity, provided an opportunity that wouldn't otherwise be available in their current district.
Were you surprised?
Yes, I'll speak for myself here. Mark may want to add to this, but I'd have been happy if we had gotten maybe a third or 40% of the people indicating that they were open to these kinds of opportunities. And the fact that we were getting 70, 75, 80+% on some of the questions was much more than I expected. Now, granted, people will say one thing in a survey, the reality is what do they do in real life, but having that kind of a base of support, saying that they were willing to consider a variety of different options that we laid out for them, I thought was a real strong indication that a lot of the barriers that you referred to earlier are not as monumental or as significant as we might have expected them to be.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to come back and talk about that variety of options in a minute. Don't go away. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. We're talking with Don Pryor and Mark Hare of Great Schools for All and Willa Powell, the Rochester City School Board. Mark, this is for you. You wrote a blog on the Great Schools for All website. Oh, let me pause for a minute. The Great Schools for All website, gs4a.org, a mountain of information there. I urge you to check it out. At any rate, the blog that you wrote is called School Integration is More Than Grades and Graduation Rates. Can you talk about what you wrote about in that?
So we know from a lot of research and evidence, Jim, that diverse schools tend to improve outcomes, especially for the poorest kids in a community. But what's interesting and what we don't get into necessarily all the time is that what's important for a city like Rochester is to have a lot of good options for schools for parents. I mean, there's no mystery that in Rochester there's a shortage of middle-class families who are willing to settle here, and one of the major issues is schools. So you need to find a system that gives them options for good schools, whether they're in the city or in Brighton or Henrietta, something they have access to. Because you find that there's an awful lot of people who are young who will tell you they want to live in the city. They prefer living in the city. Those are the parents who answered the parent survey we were talking about the last time around, people in their late 20s to early 40s who actually would like to live in the city if they had the materials and resources that they needed to do so. So Schools are important for that. So it's more than about just test scores. It's about building community again, bringing people into the city who will live here and who will invest in neighborhoods and run neighborhood associations and run for office and all of that. So it's much bigger than just improving outcomes on tests. So that's kind of the point to that. But you know, I think we have to get through and get rid of kind of these traditional notions that we've had that nobody would ever go along with these changes, because people today will go along. I mean, as Don said, I think earlier, we don't know that if you proposed one school that everybody would jump on it and say that's what we want. But we do know that it is now safe to have this conversation in the community, that people are open to it and want to hear it. So I think that's kind of where we are with it right now.
I'd like to talk about the flip side of that, what's happening in the suburbs. When I first started on the school board, there's a lot of conversation about green flight. That's as opposed to white flight. Anyone who could afford to leave the city was leaving the city, or at least that's how it was projected in the media. Well, today, the folks who are raising kids aren't the folks who left the city. They are the children of the folks who left the city. It will be very important for us to gauge the attitudes of those families and how they view the city, having been raised in the suburbs, but not having directly experienced the poverty and segregation of the city. You know, philosophically, they may be the very people on the survey that answered, yes, I'm open to that, but there may be a slip between the lip and the cup. They may not actually be prepared to take that giant step between being open and actually taking the chance.
A slip between the lip and the cup.
That came from one of my colleagues on a similar issue. Yes.
I see. I want to refer to this, another blog you wrote. Fake news sometimes is truer than the real news. You refer to a segment that appeared on John Oliver's Last Week Tonight. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. So I think that, again, the conventional wisdom about poor school districts, low-income school districts, is that the solutions usually involve just more money, more resources. If you do that, things will get better. Well, you know, we've had kind of 40 years of school reform in Rochester, and things haven't gotten a whole lot better. And a lot of that involves spending more money. So, not to say obviously that money doesn't matter, because it obviously does. It's an expensive proposition. But the John Oliver episode, which raised all of those questions, said actually, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that you can get better outcomes if you begin to integrate your schools. And I think there was part of the segment on there was interviewing some middle-class kids who basically stated in their own ways what we already know from the research, which is that it's not just better for poor children, it makes every kid smarter. People who are middle-class in diverse schools tend to figure out more ways to collaborate with others. They have a deeper appreciation for how others are living and what they're going through. It's the kind of preparation you need to live in the world that we're living in today. And I think, as basically one of the students in that piece concluded, if you want to know why it matters that middle class and poor kids are integrated in the same school, it's pretty simple. It's as simple as saying, look, where middle class kids are, where white kids are, money follows. And it's not that complicated. That's what we're talking about.
In that blog, you mentioned one thing that John Oliver said. He said, one former student says that as soon as poor schools started seeing middle-class students, suddenly there were new gyms and swimming pools and upgraded cafeterias. Little later, though, it says, by the way, in diverse schools, white kids show much less racial bias, according to that show. We're seeing these things happening in Virginia, and it's raising a national conversation now.
Well, it just makes sense. I mean, this is how do you get to know other people? How do you appreciate other people? You have to be exposed to them. And I mean, everything we've done in terms of our preparing ideas here is to say, what does the evidence tell us in the first place? And second, what do you need to do to improve the odds for the kids who are least likely to succeed? It's not about some kind of ideological platform that we want to enforce. It's what does it take to improve the odds? This is one of those things.
And we believe that it makes sense to think in terms of, as you say, we've got generational issues here. The younger generation, before a lot of those biases and prejudices kick in, if we can begin to bring that kind of melding together in our schools, both at the high school level and maybe even more importantly at the elementary and middle school level, before attitudes have hardened. We think that that augurs very well, not only for today's generation, but for going forward, both in terms of how society operates and how our business world operates in terms of just the ability to create thriving communities.
There was a book that I had read, a memoir called The Ditch Digger's Daughters, about it was a memoir of Yvonne, I'm going to forget now. She was one of 5 girls, and her father only ever wanted boys, but he taught his daughters to look for the rabbit in the classroom, find the fastest, smartest kid in the classroom, and follow and stick with them. The reason I raise that here is it never hurt the rabbit, ever.
Yeah.
To have someone look to that high-achieving student and pursue that path for themselves. Our upper-class white kids will never suffer from being integrated. It's, you know, the fear that families face is that the teacher's attention will always be directed towards the 20% of the classroom that creates 80% of the problem. It's an overstated fear, and as long as families give in to that fear, they perpetuate the segregation.
I've read in some of this literature, and I can't remember where, if the race and socioeconomic groups are separated from one another, it's like looking at them through a telescope. It's, you don't get to know them, and the thing that you see as the stereotypes. We're running out of time in this segment. We're going to come back, though. I'm going to talk about both of your visits to Raleigh, North Carolina, Wake County, and the experiment that worked for them when the city district was dissolved into the county, and with very surprising results. We'll be right back. Please don't go away. Welcome back to Spotlight on Schools. We're talking with Don Pryor and Mark Hare of Great Schools for All, and Willa Powell of the Rochester City School District. We're going to talk about a trip that Mark and Don took to Raleigh, North Carolina, Wake County a few years ago. Why did you go? What did you look for?
We were looking to see what we could learn from the Raleigh-Wake County experience, Jim. The city of Raleigh School District and the Wake County suburban schools were all consolidated in 1976, so they've got 40 years of experience with a countywide school district. Their circumstances are not at all what ours are. In New York State, it would be virtually impossible to do something like that just under the way the Constitution reads in New York State.
Because there are individual school districts within our county.
Well, and because of the big 5 cities, school districts are not fiscally independent without getting too deep into the weeds, and so it's very difficult without a change in the Constitution to even feature that. But what we could learn is when you begin to look for ways to attract students to magnet schools with the idea of making them more diverse and achieving the kinds of benefits that you would get from socioeconomic diversity, they had a lot to show us. And I think a couple of things struck me about it. One is that in the original iteration of the consolidation move, it was led by the business community, which was concerned that it was going to be very difficult to attract young families to the area if you couldn't offer them good access to good schools or great schools all the time, no matter where they lived. And that's certainly an issue here. It's the same kind of principle, I think. The other thing I thought that was kind of interesting for us, or at least for me, was that, you know, you like to think, well, you just kind of set up this system where you bust kids around, you pick the schools you want, you achieve some racial balance, and then you kind of shake the dust off your shoes and you're done. But it's not that simple. It requires kind of constant attention to try to maintain something like an even mix of 50-50 low-income and more middle-class students in a school. You have families that come in, they have siblings, that throws off the balance. So you need to constantly work at it. You need to constantly look for ways to build community within the school. If there's not a lot of opportunities for meaningful interaction in the school, if kids self-segregate in the school, you lose the benefits of it, so you have to work on that. You have to work on ways to include all the poorest kids and all the programs that are available to the more middle-class kids. It's a constant effort. But in Raleigh, I think what was very impressive to me is that the achievement they've had is a community success. I mean, it's something they brag about, that they were able to do this, that they were able to turn around the schools. And there's still a gap between the poorest kids and the richest kids.
But the rabbit, when you talk about the rabbit in the last episode, how did that apply here?
Well, again, there was no negative impact whatsoever on more affluent students in the Wake County area.
And that was the fear, wasn't it?
Well, that was part of the fear. Yeah,
well, I'm not sure it was a
issue.
fear there, because what's different about Raleigh versus Rochester is much of the business community, the middle class, the affluents in Raleigh were immigrants who were brought in because the tech industry in Raleigh. So we're talking about essentially about integration being driven by an institution, the business world, that had already become integrated. And there were no socioeconomic ceilings or barriers for non-Anglo, Native Americans. So it's a very different climate. But the fact that they could do it means it can be done. The question is whether in Rochester, New York, there's a will to do it.
Okay.
And Mark said that there is there is still a gap, but that gap has clearly been reduced in terms of academic achievement measures, graduation rates, and so on. So Will is right, it is a very different environment, but I think what they've proven is that even though you had that strong leadership from the business community, you also had whites and blacks, you had urban and suburban, you had well-off and less well-off people really coming together and creating an advocacy for this and saying this is important. And it didn't happen overnight, but they've developed something like 35 or 40 different magnet schools now that are thriving. Many of them have helped to strengthen neighborhoods in the city, and so it very much is it's a system that works, not without some fits and starts, but it clearly, as both Willa and Mark have said, it's a beacon for us. It's not a perfect mix in terms of what it says, but it clearly says that this kind of bringing together of diverse people in diverse schools, as long as you're offering something that's unique and that parents and their kids care for and that they believe will help them, it's a workable model.
Okay, we need to move ahead because we have very little time left in this segment in the show. So the next question I want to ask is, this is not just happening there. Where else are these things now happening? We have a number of places. You both wrote about some.
Well, I'll just start. Dallas is one of the places, and it relates back to the survey. I said before that the survey tells you one thing, but the question is how will people act on that survey? Dallas tells us that in a very, very conservative community, if you create opportunities for schools that don't now exist, you can bring people together from city and suburban areas. They've got a waiting list. They've created a couple of, I think it's elementary school level magnet schools that are very much in demand. So and they've got something like a 50% or 100% over waiting list over and above the numbers of slots that they had. So I think what this tells us is that yes, the survey will only take you up to a certain point, but Dallas says, given somewhat similar circumstances, and perhaps an even more conservative community, they're proving that demand, that what people say they want, actually translates into real demand when people have real decisions to make.
Okay.
I was going to say, I think you could also look, if you want something that's fairly close to Rochester in terms of models, you could look at Hartford, Connecticut, which has been doing this for 15 or 18 years. And again, the results are not mixed, are mixed. It's not a magic formula. I mean, you create these schools, you have voluntary access to them. Some of them are better integrated than others. Some of them have better outcomes than others. But there's progress being made. So, and there are lots of cities around the country where some steps have been taken.
Okay, I want to put on the screen a chart that Mark provided me, which compares the city and several county school districts on the basis of percentage of students economically disadvantaged, percentage of those students proficient in the ELA and math tests in grades 3 through 8, and the graduation rate. Mark, we only have a couple of minutes, but I wonder if you can take us through some of the highlights of this chart.
So we talk about how when you deal with the concentration of poverty, you have schools that are not exclusively poverty, poor kids in the school, the poor kids are going to do better. So Rochester has about a 91% poverty rate, high concentration of poverty, highly segregated school system. And we talk about how this has been successful in other parts of the country, but just look at Monroe County. So in Rochester, 91% of students economically disadvantaged. Graduation rate for those poor kids is 48%. Just look 2 miles away in East Irondequoit, 56% disadvantaged kids, graduation rate 84%, lower concentration of poverty. Look at Gates Chili, 47% disadvantaged kids, 77% graduation rate for those same kids. So you see this repeated over and over again, and you don't need to go to Raleigh or Hartford to see that this matters. You can look right across the school district lines of Monroe County and see exactly what happens.
Okay, thank you for that. We are out of time for this program. Didn't it go fast?
It did. It does.
Don and Mark, thank you from Great Schools for All. Please check out their website, gs4a.org. You'll see it right under my face right now. And Willa Powell from City School District. We're going to have part 2 of this program. Willa's going to get a lot more time on that show. And we'll talk about what are the nuts and bolts of breakthrough schools and what's happening now that the City School District has come on board and we're starting to move into the suburbs.
We're doing I think a big community event on the night of October 26th, and you can find information about that on the website as well. But New York Times Magazine writer Nicole Hannah-Jones is going to be with us. She has a fascinating story herself about diversity. She is an expert on diverse schools and what it takes and what are the obstacles and how do you do this. And she'll be talking at Third Presbyterian Church at 7 o'clock, and you can get all the information you need about great schools there and how to sign up for other things. So.
What date?
October 26th.
Now it's free, but you got to register, which I've done. You can watch this and other episodes of Spotlight on Schools on our website at spotlightonschools.wordpress.com or on our YouTube channel at Spotlight on Schools Rochester. Thank you for watching. Good night. How's that? Did I get it all?